guess we're on. Hello, everyone. It is afternoon on the 18th of February, and or the 21st of February. I've got the wrong agenda up on my calendar. Excuse me very much. Let me fix that. But I first start off with an introduction to explain what the Affordable Housing Commission is. Okay, I guess we're set now. And the Affordable Housing Commission is, the Athens City Affordable Housing Commission is a commission of city government established to review best practices, investigate community affordable housing models, and identify needs and opportunities within Athens city limits to advance a decent, safe, sustainable, affordable housing for all city residents. The commission is tasked with providing advice and guidance on measures and policies that influence access to and needs within the local housing markets. We want to emphasize that there's somewhat of a misnomer or misunderstanding about what needs to be done with affordable housing. It's not just about low-income housing. It's housing to ensure that we have worker housing and housing for people with disabilities and seniors, all levels of housing for the whole community. So it's important that we do that. In any case, just moving right along, the next is to establish quorum, and we do have a couple people missing, but we do have quorum, so we can move forward and make some decisions. The next is our minutes. I sent them out to everybody, actually a couple of times. So if there's any changes or concerns about the minutes, let us know. Otherwise, if I don't see any, we're going to vote for approval of the minutes from January.
So moved.
Okay, second? Anybody have a second?
Second.
Okay, thank you. All right, vote for aye if it's okay.
Aye.
Okay, great. We're in then. We've got minutes. Okay, the next thing is we have a speaker today, which I'm very excited about. Zach Rices. I said it right. I asked him ahead of time. We can describe him as a consultant organizer. He's done a lot of work for the county and for around the state, I think, really. And he is going to explain land trusts. This is I think, possibly a wonderful opportunity that we're not using at this point, but has been used around the country for housing, and Zach is going to graciously explain what it means, and we can talk about it and ask questions and see if we want to move forward with doing something about land trusts. Okay, Zach, you're on.
Okay, hey everybody. Nice to see you. Thanks for the introduction, Solveig. I guess I would add that I am not a housing policy expert, sort of by training. I am a advocate and passionate sort of researcher around affordable housing policy. So if there are questions you ask that are highly technical in nature, I might, at some point say, hey, we should go talk to a lawyer, or we should bring somebody from one of the multiple organizations that do national advocacy on, land trusts or housing policy to the table. Those folks, especially in today's day and age, can be very pricey. So I can certainly help provide the commission with a pretty solid understanding of what community land trusts are and how they've been used in housing policy in general. I have a presentation that I will send to Solveig to be circulated among the commission members. It's just a general overview, which this verbal presentation will also serve just fine to provide. And the key thing to know with a community land trust or a CLT is that a CLT is a nonprofit organization that operates the way that land trust would operate if you're familiar with a conservation trust. So land that goes into trust for the sake of conservation, this is the same structure, except the land is being held in trust to maintain a stock of affordable housing. And as Solveig referenced in her introduction about the commission, this CLTs are primarily used not to create housing stock for low-income or no-income households. They're primarily used to buoy against a rapidly inflating housing market. And the basic mechanism of the way that that works is a 501c3 organization is established. That can be an existing organization. It doesn't have to be a new one. But that 501c3 has a stated mission, as all 501c3 charitable organizations do. And the stated mission with a community land trust is to preserve and maintain an affordable housing stock. And then they do that through a legal mechanism through which when a resident of a community goes to buy a house from a community land trust, what they're doing is they're buying the house itself, or, on an auditor's record, you'll see the improvements, but they're not buying the land underneath it. And instead, they're receiving a 99-year ground lease from the land trust. So the land trust is holding that land in trust, but is providing a ground lease to the resident for that land. So for all intents and purposes, anything that you or I do as a homeowner on a daily basis, mowing a lawn or building a shed, planting a garden, you are well within your rights as the resident to do that. And in fact, it's your responsibility to upkeep that land just the same. However, by maintaining ownership of that land in trust, a couple of things happen. The primary one is that a land trust as a 501c3 organization, as a charitable organization, typically will receive public subsidy in some form, allowing them to buy or build those units. And when they go to sell the unit to a resident, they're selling it below market value. So then you're getting somebody to enter the housing market below the market value of that house if it were sold on a private market. By virtue of that land trust owning the land underneath the house, the second thing that they do is they establish that when the homeowner goes to sell that house, say they've been living in it for 10 years, it's appreciated, they own equity in it because they've been paying, on a monthly basis to a lender, they will sell that house, but they are not going to take 100% of the equity they've accrued in that house. Instead, they will take, 50%, 60%, some predetermined amount of that equity for themselves. It's a great stepping stone into buying their next home, which maybe they own outright. But the land trust then takes a cut off of that resale, which provides an opportunity for the land trust to have stable and recurring revenue to support the organization's operations. The last thing that's pretty typical with land trust homes is that the homeowner is restricted from selling it at market value. Typically, a CLT will establish some formula. It could be as simple as 75% of comp homes in the area, but they'll establish a formula for resale that prevents that house from being resold at market value. And the primary reason why I really love this structure so much is because through Welcome Home Ohio, for example, which you might have discussed as a commission, it's a current state program to allow for the construction of new homes that will be sold below market value. They're subsidized. That subsidy only lasts through one sale. And then there's really not great restrictions that allow for that subsidy to live on and permanently maintain the affordability of that home. By virtue of having a land trust in place and having that land underneath it owned by that community-rooted organization, there's a perpetual affordability that is created through the land trust model. So, again, just to review and to sum up the basic mechanism, a land trust acquires land and the house on top of it. Usually that's going to be through public subsidy. In fact, it almost exclusively has to be through public subsidy. They're then going to sell the house to a homeowner while ground leasing that land that's underneath it to that same homeowner. Homeowner lives in it like there's no difference, and the only difference occurs when they go to resale the house and they have to sell it below market value. The last thing I'll reference about this, I sort of started here, is this is not, this is one tool in the toolkit for creating a community where you've got a diversified housing stock that serves people at all ends of the income spectrum. And this specific tool is really good for pushing back against the forces of inflation and appreciation, or gentrification, if you want to use sort of a loaded term. And the more houses that a community land trust has sort of under management, the more opportunity it has to maintain a stock of housing that is accessible to people at different income levels. The last, I guess I said that was the last thing. One more thing, let me just reference. Everything I just outlined is sort of the basic principles for a CLT. It's not really a CLT by the traditional framing if it's not performing that function with the 99-year ground lease and the sale of the house on top of it. However, there are over 250 land trusts nationwide. There's several in Ohio. Yellow Springs was the first community to have a land trust in Ohio. Franklin County, Greater Cleveland, Cincinnati all have established land trusts for this explicit purpose. A CLT, though, can do things their own way. So one pretty unique traditional structure of a CLT involves a board where you've got land trust residents as members of the board, along with local policy leaders and then topical experts, like, for example, a real estate attorney who's donating their time to the organization. You don't have to do that. You can do that. It's one of the ways of creating a board that has real community roots to it. Land trusts can also manage units of rental property and could just serve generally as a housing manager. And I advocate for that model because if you're able to have sort of mixed income housing under management, those higher end units will help subsidize the sort of lost funds that go into the lower end units that you're keeping at a high level of performance, but you're not necessarily getting the income to offset those costs. So everything I outlined provides a pretty traditional basic structure, but just remember that at the end of the day, a CLT is just a 501c3 organization with the mission of maintaining affordable housing, and any community can really choose to play with that however they so choose. There's lots of best practices out there. There's several organizations that are consulting actively nationwide on this. As you know, this is not an Athens-specific issue. And I can point you guys towards some of those resources as well if you want to do your own reading. Yeah, this is sort of the end of the basic overview, and I'd be very happy to answer questions or have a discussion about what this could look like in Athens.
Yeah,
Okay.
Zach, thanks for that overview. I'm wondering about, so you mentioned the possibility of CLTs, I guess a couple questions. The possibility of CLTs managing like multi-unit housing, which is really intriguing to me, especially because we don't have a lot of land to develop as single-family housing, and if the more land that we do have that is available that we develop as single-family is kind of locking out, the potential for us to add density over time that we really need. How, first question is like a CLT managing kind of a multi-unit, some sort of multi-unit property, whether that's townhomes, duplex, or apartments. Are there any kind of intricacies to that beyond like a typical model where you might have like an HOA depending on the type of housing or something like that, but is there anything unique to the CLT managing multi-family or multi-unit housing?
Yeah, specifically, no. Once again, to be as unhelpful as possible, a CLT can do what it wants to do. And so, if that nonprofit chooses to manage multi-family or multi-unit properties, then its only real responsibility in that instance is for its own finances, like any other organization. And you want to make sure that you've got a diversified portfolio that supports the organization. But that's functioning in the same way that a private property manager would. It's just as a 501c3 with a board, which has its strengths and its weaknesses structurally, but largely affords you the opportunity to be, again, community rooted and maybe more responsible to its residents.
Okay. And what about, let's say it is a single family or, more of a typical owner occupied, even like a duplex or something that someone owns outright. If someone wants to add on or improve the home, does the model where the CLT is taking a percentage of that equity, does that disincentivize someone from improving a home? Or could that disincentivize improving a home because you're not actually capturing, all of the equity that you might typically get, if you own the entire property outright?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would suggest that that probably does not disincentivize folks making improvements in their homes. But it's going to depend on the situation. It's going to depend on the person. My view of the folks that this model really serves is that they're going to be the same as any of us. You're going to be a homeowner who is, walking through your kitchen and thinks, man, I really want new countertops. And if you've saved up for it, possibly because you're paying less on a mortgage because you're not paying for the land underneath your feet, then that affords you the opportunity to make those improvements. Ultimately, I guess I skipped over this in my, in my spiel here. The fact that this is a wealth building tool where an individual or a family is building equity is paramount to the whole structure. And so, it's an interesting question I'd like to do more research on to see if there's any longitudinal studies that have been done about, do CLT residents, abstain from putting money into those properties? I think that the answer to that is no.
Thank you so much. That was, I really appreciate how clear you made that. I think it was, you didn't make it complicated. I think you made it very clear, and thank you, Zach. I really appreciate that. Okay, so some of the legal questions. Oh, can I finish mine? And then I'll go to you.
I just had a question. Could you tell us a little about what is happening with land trusts in Athens County and southeastern Ohio?
Sure. Yeah, to my knowledge, there is not a community land trust that operates in this model I just outlined anywhere in Appalachian, Ohio. That might not be true if you get up into the Youngstown area. They've got some pretty active land banks, and they might be dabbling in this arena. But in Southeast Ohio, to my knowledge, there is not an active land trust doing what I've described here. Interesting question. I will sort of add an additional aside. There's often confusion between land banks and land trusts. And let me speak to that for just a moment, and then I'm going to return to what could be happening. It's more of a potential in Athens County. A land bank is a quasi-governmental agency that was set up by the state of Ohio, and they've got sort of statutory authority around slum and blight demolition and property acquisition that other organizations do not have. You all might have discussed this already if folks from the land bank have come to speak. A land trust is very explicitly a 501c3 organization, so there's no government, explicit government direction given there. And I don't know of any states that have done anything other than sort of allow land trusts to exist. I don't know of any state level incentives for land trusts. Of course, an incentive that might exist in Ohio in the future would be additional funding towards housing, affordable housing construction. What form that takes, I couldn't say, but I think it's very likely that the state legislature makes more housing development dollars available. So that adds an additional incentive for this community to, really invest some significant time in figuring out if the state makes those dollars available, who's going to accept them, and then who's going to administer those, them. Back to the question at hand. In Athens in particular, I will say that I think the first time I spoke to the Affordable Housing Commission, a previous iteration about CLTs was back in 2018. I've been a long-term fan of CLTs. We haven't, as a community down here, made any moves in this direction, but of course, as is referenced in the Athens County Foundation housing report that was attached to this meeting, there's certainly a lot of focus from HAPCAP Integrated Services, the Athens County Foundation, the City of Athens, Athens County. All the right stakeholders are engaged already in having these conversations. I would say this might be a tool that would be of great value, but we have to figure out how we're going to pay for it.
Okay, that brings up a couple questions for me. You said that there really weren't much in the way of Ohio revised code kind of restrictions regarding this, and I wanted to pursue that a little bit further. For example, is it, does zoning matter? Does certain size of property matter, something like that? What about those kinds of potential restrictions?
All of that will be determined by the local zoning code or regulations at the local level.
Okay.
You know, if a community land trust could, for example, say that we are explicitly interested in building and maintaining a stock of single-family residential homes. Well, that's going to be a zoning question. Do you have land where you can build single-family residential? If a CLT wants to explicitly focus on density, then you're going to have to engage with our we know the crowd. We're standing in the room here. You have to engage with your local authority around zoning regulations. But to operate specifically the tool that I've outlined with regards to sale of the improvements, lease of the land, that's, to my knowledge, that's not there's no state restrictions that would prevent an organization from doing that.
Okay, another potential barrier that I can't help but wonder about is how much pushback do communities get from developers, landlords, folks who might see this as a threat to their business? And to what extent has that been an issue in other places?
That's another great question. I'm going to have to plead ignorance in answering it. There's several very large land trusts nationwide that, conceivably we could reach out to. I've got a friend who works for the Grounded Solutions Network, which is sort of the premier national advocacy and technical assistance organization around CLTs. They were much more accessible back in 2018, and their team has been underwater since then because of all of the changes that happened to the national housing market during COVID. So there's a lot more spotlight, a lot more attention being paid to the CLT model, and it makes consulting from the Grounded Solutions Network just a little bit more of a lift. Worthwhile, I would argue, and that would be a question I'd want to ask them. We could also, of course, reach out to the Yellow Springs Land Trust or the Franklin County Land Trust and ask that same question. The market in Athens, I will add, is a little bit different than the market in a Franklin County, for example. And so whereas we've got developable land shortage that is really shaped by both topography as well as where our economic engines are based in this county and in this city, Franklin County has a lot more developable space around it. So I'm pleading ignorance, but I would guess that there is always pushback when it comes to housing development. As many of you know, in this particular instance, you do have the benefit of CLT properties not really facing the stigma of serving low-income households, which is not a stigma I would personally want to feed into, but in this instance, we are benefited by it being a tool that's really intended to create housing at the, for folks at the income level of teachers and firefighters and nonprofit workers and city council members and retirees. That's a lot greater swath of the population.
That's great. I have all kinds of other questions, but since I don't want to take up all of everybody, Kimberly.
Zach, how do you acquire the properties for the CLT?
Yeah, if you've got money from any kind of public source, you can buy land with it. And so, as I referenced, maybe the greatest hurdle with a CLT is that initial property acquisition dollars. That's a hurdle for a couple of reasons. There are many grant funds that don't allow real estate acquisition. Many that do, but many that don't. If the state puts forth a program that allows property to be purchased, and the Welcome Home Ohio Fund that does exist at the state does allow for that, then you can use any kinds of public dollars. Otherwise, you are going to be likely turning to local philanthropy or lending. Go ahead.
I think my question is how do you locate them, since it's not a land bank that we know blighted or bad taxes? This is a trust.
Yes.
So when we look at open areas in Athens, how do you even start identifying things that potentially could be bought for trust, and how is that actually done?
Yeah, well, first, a community land trust could acquire property from a land bank.
Okay.
So in Franklin County, the land trust is an offshoot of the land bank. They started it in-house there. Other than that, really the question of which properties you identify as priority properties comes down to what the priority of the land trust is. So the land trust board is going to have to decide, do we want to build 40 new homes just on the edge of town, or do we want to acquire fixer-uppers in the heart of town, for example? Do we want to focus on single-family residential at a $200,000 or below price point, or do we want to focus on single-family residential starter homes that we have to subsidize down to a $100,000 price point? And the question of focus, with limited dollars, we all have to make choices. That's really going to drive the strategy that a land trust would use to identify or acquire properties. If I could sort of editorialize, this is very much my own opinion, not necessarily a land trust general thing. I think that any land trust, especially in Athens, should prioritize first, and this might be controversial, but should prioritize first market rate rentals that are safe and at a high standard of living, but where you have enough income coming in to subsidize your basic operating staff and your property management, because that's going to be the first hurdle, is operational sustainability. Once you've got that, if you've got one or two folks whose job can be to write grants and seek out other money, that can solve some of these other larger challenges. So that's sort of my opinion number one. My opinion number two is the other thing about a 501c3 organization is that it can accept donations as a tax write-off. And in this town in particular, with a large number of, or I should say a small number of landlords who own large numbers of properties, there's definitely a play to be made to say, hey, would you sell us a property at 50% of market, but we'll give you a donation receipt for the other 50% so you can write that off on your taxes. And that would be a strategy to acquire potential fixer-uppers that allows the land trust to acquire more for less, plays to the economics of this town, and then provides the land trust an opportunity to fix up a housing stock that's currently not seeing very much investment.
So, Zach, and I'm sorry, I might be
No,
struggling
please.
a little bit. So the only way we can acquire these properties are when they go up for sale, either by the owner, or if something was existing in a land bank, or somebody's willing to deed it over for some percentage.
Yeah, I mean, or you've got private, you've got staff that approaches a landlord and says, hey, we see a lot of potential with this property, you're not fixing it up, we've got the funds, could we work out a private market deal? That would be sort of the option number 4.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Anybody else? So how do you suggest, oh, go ahead.
Does the lease go to, like, when a person buys a home, they have a lease, and that lease is paid, to the land trust? Is it sort of like an HOA?
Great question. So structurally, so I'll repeat the question because I know this is broadcast through the microphone. So the question is, if structurally, if somebody's got a lease on the land and they're paying on the home, are they paying a lease fee that goes directly to the land trust? That falls into that bucket of land trusts can structure things how they'd like to. Most traditionally, the land trust is not charging a lease fee, but actually has partnered with a lender. That lender is servicing the mortgages. That mortgage is just to the size, scaled to the size of the value of the improvements that were sold. And then the land trust gets paid when that house is resold, according to that resale formula I mentioned in my presentation, which, again, there's some sort of standard formulas, but the land trust could say 50% of the accrued equity or, 25% of the accrued equity comes back to the land trust at sale.
Okay, any questions from the audience? Okay,
I have one more question.
Sure.
Zach, you talked about, this being one of many tools. I guess I'm wondering, like at the county level, there's been talk of establishing a CRA to, as a kind of a property tax abatement tool. Like, so it seems like this could be a good opportunity to potentially stack other tools like a community reinvestment area, to be able to also kind of drive down some of those costs over time, whether that's passed on to the land trust and captured as a source of income, or to the homeowner to like further, is there, I mean, does that make sense, right? Like, are there any obstacles to doing something like that?
Yeah, the main obstacle is that it's very complicated. So yes, there are lots of economic development tools that can be layered. Community revitalization areas, special improvement districts, new community authorities. I've had a pretty extensive conversation with a lawyer up in Columbus who's passionate about this exact topic, where we've postulated, but never done it, that you could stack a new community authority against with a CRA with a land trust. So the way that would function is you could eliminate some of the tax burden on that property. You could then use a community reinvestment area to still charge some amount of, it wouldn't be a tax, but it would be some charged assessed rate on the new community authority that would go into a fund. It's very similar to the new community authority that was set up for the Ridges. And then the land trust would do its thing, as we've discussed. The big downside to anything, so the upsides are any layering of tools that allow for cost savings, for example, saving on material sales tax or reducing tax burden, is a great thing for the homeowner. Once you start to add fees back in, for example, this is a little bit of an aside, but lots of energy efficiency programs work by financing the improvements, by toggling the amount of improvements to the dollars saved on the utility bills. The downside of that is the homeowner doesn't necessarily see those savings because you're charging a different kind of assessment in place of the taxes. And I like our local governments and I want them to be well funded, so the challenge with a situation like that isn't that it's not doable, it's that it's A, legally complicated, so you just need to work with a good set of attorneys, and B, that if you're not careful, you end up just replacing the dollars saved with other fees and assessments that are being charged to the residents.
Okay, on that note, you mentioned the new community authority and the Ridges, and as you know, that the property is being moved for ownership from the university to the new community authority, and there's a potential of 700 housing units. Since this is under early discussion at this point, it hasn't been completely transferred yet, is that something that we could even bring up to the new community authority as something we could do with some or part or whatever, that land?
Yes, absolutely. That could be, that could be done. I'm very pro land trusts as a structure. The challenge with every single one of these entities, from a CIC to a CLT to a, land bank, a land reutilization corporation, is every single one of them requires layers of management and oversight. And the more you stack those systems, the more complicated that can become. So the last thing that I'd want to do is try introducing a land trust concept to the Ridges, and perhaps the sale of those housing units, goes to subsidize some other improvements at the Ridges. What I wouldn't want to do is overcomplicate a system that prevents development from taking place. Like, that is ultimately the goal. Developing a land trust that could work with the new community authority, I think, is an excellent idea. And I think also, a land trust that works in the city of Athens could still work in the county of Athens and focus on different priorities or the same priorities. Those two entities, a new community authority and a land trust, work well together, with this sort of foresight of recognizing let's not create systems that get in their own way.
Yeah, I'm sure there's lots and lots of layers to that. So, and lots of information that you've gathered that are way beyond our conversation today.
I just
Molly?
have one quick question. Can you remind me, Zach, if the land bank, if this has been discussed with the land bank at all? Are they aware or open to housing a community land trust?
Yeah, I've never discussed this with the land bank board. I think that's the short answer. The slightly longer answer is that it's important to remember that the land bank and the land trust fundamentally operate in different ways, and that the Athens County Land Bank and the Athens City Housing Commissions have different goals. And they're both headed in the same direction, but the needs of the county and the needs of the city are not necessarily the same from a housing perspective. And so I am pro having that discussion, but I wouldn't want to lose sight of the city-specific goals and how, a different organization might pursue them.
Okay, there's two parts to this question. One is, the essential question is, how do we get started? And the other question is, what models have you seen in terms of how they become an entity that works the best? The ones that come out of an umbrella of the land trust, or something completely separate, or new community authority? I mean, or where do you think that should go?
Yes. Okay, so how do we get started? I think it starts with cash on the table. You need to acquire a property in order to even trial run this. And it could just be one property, but it's the only way to do it is to acquire a house and try it out. A little bit more broadly, I sort of hinted at this earlier, that I've thought about what a CLT in Athens could look like for a long time, and the city has a lot of housing needs, as we all know, at many different income levels. My suggestion would be to form a CLT that has a couple of the following in mind. The first is that the city is heavily weighted towards rental units, to the tune of about 30% homeowner occupied, 70% rental units. You've likely all heard that statistic. A CLT can exist to help right that balance. Like, that is the right tool to say, hey, our stock of housing is going to be flipped. It's going to be 70% homeowner occupied, and we're going to maintain our portfolio to be 30% rental units. And in this town in particular, there's great need for rental units. So I think that's also a totally valid thing. The other area that I would suggest focusing on is acquiring units with, if we have grant dollars to get started, I would acquire enough units to have a monthly source of recurring revenue to at least begin to offset the costs of the people who are going to do the work to find the rest of the money. And that might be a little bit of a controversial perspective, because you want to address the biggest issue first, which is housing for people that can't afford it. I do think the biggest issue with a CLT is you want to have an executive director or a part-time director or somebody whose job is to write the grants and track the money and then facilitate the construction of new housing units. The other thing that I would suggest focusing on in conversation is, you've got sort of two parallel challenges. The one challenge is the shortage of developable land for new developments. And one of the ways that could be addressed is having an entity whose job is to secure MOUs with homeowners, or excuse me, not homeowners, with landowners, so that you've pre-negotiated a purchase price if and when the funding comes through to buy the land. That's sort of a necessity in a lot of grants, is being able to go to the funder and say, we've pre-negotiated the sale price of this amount with this homeowner. Here's how much utilities are going to cost. Here's how much infrastructure we need. Here's how many units. But you got to start with the land. So that's one of the things I think a CLT could do, where you presently don't necessarily have an organization who can do that for residential development. And then on the flip side, the other component to that conversation is we do have an aging housing stock. And as I was sort of alluding to earlier, a CLT could also be an entity that acquires houses that are already built. Costs a lot less to fix up a house than it does to build a new house. Gross generalization, you could always be improving houses, but to create safe, livable environments, a CLT for the city in particular could focus on a block or set of blocks and help improve the neighborhood improve the neighborhood while mitigating the inevitable house price increases that come when you take a neighborhood that doesn't look good and suddenly it's got green lawns and fences. So it provides a backstop to its own success, I suppose I would say.
Oh, this is great. Anybody else want to weigh in here? We're kind of floating through time here and taking longer than we intended, but this is very interesting, and I would love to talk more about this. We're going to transition into talking about LIHTC.
Great.
So, one more question then. Could there be a LIHTC CLT kind of situation? Is that something, because there's been some discussion of something like that? Does that make any sense at all?
So fundamentally, LIHTC provides rental units, and a CLT is a tool that's intended to facilitate home ownership and equity building. They're just fundamentally different concepts. And in addition to that, yes, there is, but the difference is first. And in addition to that, LIHTC is traditionally developed by private developers, not exclusively. There are nonprofit LIHTC developers as well. Fairfield Homes, Integrated Services has done some of this. But ultimately, you're achieving different aims and you're using different kinds of funds to do it. Because the LIHTC program is just a federal program with very specific regulations. The two ways that I could see the two playing together are as follows. If a CLT acquired a large enough piece of land, they could have a LIHTC developer build a LIHTC development on that land for some kind of lease arrangement where they would charge a lease fee or charge a development fee or percentage of a development fee, which could then go into subsidize that land trust. All LIHTC developers have to buy the land they develop on, unless they partner with a nonprofit to build it on that nonprofit's land. So that could be one way to have the two overlap. And the other way I'd see those two concepts working in concert is if LIHTC development is much more controversial in many instances than community land trust developments are. So one way to make the two jive with one another could be to have the reverse model work, where if a LIHTC developer buys land, they could donate a percentage of that land, maybe adjacent to the land trust, to develop homeowner occupied units. There's lots of ways to make that work, but I would stick with fundamentally they're accomplishing different things. So kind of depends on how much capacity the land trust has and whether or not the LIHTC developer in question wants to play ball.
Well, that brings up one more question,
Sure.
but it does relate to our other topic, and that is, we've been told by the opponents of the Pomeroy Road LIHTC project that there is an option to use LIHTC to become a homeowner or a apartment owner. And I'm hearing you say that's not really true.
I'm not a LIHTC expert. Mm-hmm. I've worked with LIHTC developers. One of my best friends works for a LIHTC developer, but I am not familiar enough with LIHTC to suggest what's possible there.
Okay.
The LIHTC credits do expire after the lifetime of the credits. So it's possible, I suppose, to have a developer commit to converting those into condos, but I'm just guessing, and you'd have to ask a developer.
Okay, I just wondered, since you were so knowledgeable about the other, I had to throw that out there since
LIHTC's
it's on the table.
complicated.
Okay,
I think it's typically a 30-year agreement.
Yes.
And typically, like Zach said, you would have to condominiumize those, which is not a very common process. It happens, but I mean, that seems like more of a one-off kind of scenario as opposed to a typical.
well, it's been one of the arguments against accepting the Pomeroy Road one.
I don't know, I've never heard
And
of
I
that being the
People are
found.
against eventual homeownership?
No, they're saying that we shouldn't accept a rental thing when we could do something that would eventually lead to home ownership.
Oh, okay, so you're saying that they're proposing something
That we
right
should,
now as an alternative?
yeah, that we
Okay.
should reject this one and try to find somebody who would be willing to do that, is what I'm saying. And I asked our attorney, she didn't know, and so, anyway.
I will reach out to my friend and see if I can get his perspective on that. But while I'm up here and I'm going to get off stage because I know you've got a lot of other things to talk about, LIHTC might have its flaws, but it's the most efficient way we have of developing affordable low-income housing. And we're in a situation where the more housing we have, the better. So I am pro that development, if that matters at all. I think more housing that's affordable is better for this whole community. Thanks all.
Thank you very much for coming, and I look forward to seeing what you send us and hopefully some resources
Yeah.
as well. Great.
pleasure.
Thank you so much, Zach. Take care. All right, well, obviously that took a little longer than we had anticipated, and I perhaps should apologize that I asked perhaps more questions than you wanted me to, but I think it's an important conversation, and I think that we should. Just real quick, since I do like to keep this at about an hour to respect everybody's time, I think we might cut back on some of the other conversation. As you know, and perhaps if you saw my email this morning, and that is that Spire Developers has decided to back off and not request the rezoning. Therefore, unfortunately, we still have to talk about it tonight at City Council because it's on the table for third reading, and so we have to vote for something. Because, as I discussed in the mission of our commission, we do have a responsibility to advise what we think on issues. But because of this situation, I thought, do you want to talk about this and make a recommendation about what City Council should do regarding this? Obviously, the options are vote no for a R1 to R3 zoning change, or vote yes, or just table it. And tabling it means that maybe someday in the future, when there's more information or a new developer or whatever, that we can make those decisions. So, any comment about that?
Well, a rezone is, I think a lot of times when these applications come in, it becomes a conversation about, like this project has, it becomes a conversation about, the intent of the developer, the integrity of the developer, or what is being built, when the reality is a rezone is a land use tool, which should reflect, how, the city master plan, how the city, the city's like housing goals, how land should be utilized to meet those goals. And I think for those reasons, when you look at this property on a map, and, it's currently right on the edge of an R1 zone, directly adjacent to another apartment building, I believe a Proco's apartment building, and directly adjacent to two B zones, I believe a B1 and a B3. So this property, from a land use perspective, is exactly, this is exactly the type of rezone that you would typically see, is an upzone to allow density, responding to the demands of, what we need as the community, which is more housing at a higher density. There were a lot of, I think, infrastructure concerns brought up about this project, which those exist regardless of what happens on this property. And I think when you think about what can be built there now and what can be built with an R3, if you just build single-family homes on this property, it's very unlikely that any of that development would contribute positively to the kind of infrastructure problems that already exist, like flooding and stormwater, whereas a larger development like an R3 development that has more rigorous permitting requirements are actually legally required to some degree to address stormwater management, to address grading and infrastructure concerns. That may not address all of, the concerns that have been brought up, but like I said, those concerns about traffic and safety and stormwater, those are issues that exist regardless, and that if these are serious ongoing issues, they need to be addressed regardless of what's built there. So, I think from a land use perspective, upzoning from R1 to R3 makes a lot of sense for this property, and I think it's something that, I think we should be encouraging to happen more throughout the city, because we have an abundance of R1 and very little R2 and R3 that allows for the types of development that we really need.
Thank you very much. I've been, it's no secret that I have been very supportive of changing this from an R1 to an R3 for the reasons, as Shay very articulately said. And I think the situation that has been presented as a dangerous road and that it's bad for pedestrians, and also the other argument about flooding that, does exist and is a problem now. Again, as Shay described, in order for them to do anything on this property, based on my conversation with the engineering people and for Athens, as well as Andy Stone, that's his background, they both assured me that, in fact, they would not allow anything to be built there without requiring that those changes, those issues be addressed. And I said, just flat out, can they be addressed? Is there a resolution? If they put, pedestrian walkways and, cleaned up the infrastructure related to flooding, can this be addressed? And they assured me that, yes, it can. So those arguments, in addition to what Shay again said very well, really convinces me. Other arguments that have brought up have been, issues that are essentially unrelated, but people are concerned about, and that is crime. Well, they brought up Kershaw Green. Kershaw Green is down the street from me. Kershaw Green, the arrests at Kershaw Green in 2024 was 1% of the arrests in Athens City, 1%. So, and that's 291 units. This would be 50. So again, not a good argument. In addition, there is an abundance of research showing that it's really a very good tool to help folks at the lower income levels to thrive and survive. And I think we really need that. A third issue is they will have elevators. Of course, they probably won't do anything, but we could, at this point, who knows if they come back and want to do this another time. But based on what we saw, I don't think they own the property. I think this was contingent upon, whether everything goes through. So I did quite a bit of work in looking at research having to do with, these kinds of projects. And we also talked to the Woda Cooper, Zach and I, and one of the attorneys from LASCO talked to the leadership of Kershaw Green, and they really actually do a pretty good job. They're required to do things like provide services for folks, like maybe financial management, so they could handle their finances better. We're looking into things like how can you, what kind of services do you need? What kinds of issues can we help you with? That sort of thing. And they have Kershaw Green management has a contract with HABCAP to provide supportive services. So this is something they would have to do. And because they would have had elevators, again, they could have had more opportunities for people who have disabilities to live there. Anyway, those issues are a moot point. I think what is really the issue is, do you want to, or do you want to just pass on it, recommend to council that they vote yes, or do you feel like you're not comfortable with that? And again, I'm fine with tabling it since we have no idea what's going to happen in the future, but my preference would be yes. But again, there's a lot of people on the commission. You all need to decide whether you feel comfortable enough to make a recommendation at all and what that recommendation might be.
Well, Sylvia, I think is one of the things, so because Spire withdrew their application, this would specifically be support for the rezone, which has nothing
Right.
to do with
Exactly.
any sort of development proposal.
Exactly.
And so this would not be any sort of endorsement for what was originally loosely
Exactly.
proposed.
Exactly.
But it could create an opportunity for another developer, which wouldn't necessarily have to be a LIHTC developer.
Exactly.
To build something, which would be more feasible on that site than what is currently allowed. Whereas, a no vote would allow, a future, if someone else buys that property in the future, they could come back to ask for a rezone. But really it would be, upzoning this property kind of independent of any development.
Yes,
Creating
and-
a new opportunity for development,
Exactly.
which I'm in support of and would certainly be in support of, making that recommendation.
And based on the issues of flooding and whatnot, probably somebody wanting to build single-family homes would not do that, would not buy the property.
That could, in my opinion, could likely be a lot worse than, because we don't have we have very minimal code enforcement for single family, for residential. Whereas,
Yes.
anything that's multi-unit, that's more a typical R3 kind of development would be legally required to have civil engineers involved to meet well-established standards for stormwater and grading, which which it typically means improving stormwater and drainage. And those are very common, concerns with any development project that's controversial is
Sure.
the stormwater and drainage. The reality is those things are usually legally improved because they're required to through that process.
Okay.
What's
Any
the
other-
downside? I guess, why wouldn't we want to recommend changing it to an R3?
I think without a bid on what it's being used for now, it kind of is changing something preemptively.
Okay.
And I don't know, if we look at it and the hope was to have the affordable housing, and now that it's backed out, we don't have the specifics of what's next to take place. I guess that would be the issue, is we're converting without something on the table, which would make me concerned, just in the sense that maybe there's a different place that affordable housing could be placed, and this could remain potentially, it could be open for a business, it could be a single family, it could be something different. So I think if there was something on the table, if this was still on the table and it was presented, I think that's one thing, but preemptively creating something that somebody hasn't shown a new interest in, I think would be possibly not our best choice, but that's just my view.
Well, it would still have to go through all of the engineering and, approvals, et cetera. So it could be any kind, it wouldn't be a business. It would have to be some kind of multi-unit
So
housing.
did Spire back out because of the feedback they were getting?
That appears to be what they're telling us. And they said that there's been a lot of misinformation that's been spread, and I guess they don't want to deal with it anymore.
I believe an upzone from R1 to R3 actually would not prevent any current uses from being allowed to be built. So if you upzone from R1 to R3, you can build everything that you could build in an R2. I believe this is true, but you can build everything that you could build in an R2 and an R1, but you can also build to a higher density for something that might be more appropriate for a site that's for a larger undeveloped property. And I think, I think that's always a concern about not knowing how something might be used. But the reality is if Spire were to go through this rezoning process, or any developer were to go through this rezoning process, there's typically not anything binding them to building what they, maybe presented when they rezoned. As far as I know, besides the plan unit development process, which Megan has talked about a little bit in our zoning code, I don't think Athens has anything in the zoning code that would bind a developer, beyond, through a rezone application like this into actually building anything in particular other than what is allowed by right. So that's something that we don't really have in our zoning code as a tool anyways.
Okay. Polly, did you want to say something?
Well, I just wanted to say, for me, I do not feel like I have enough information that as a
Sorry.
commission for me to give a recommendation personally. So, I have another appointment.
That's
I'll
my
have to
son,
leave.
sorry.
That's okay, so I just have an appointment I have to leave, so I just wanted to say, however you vote or whatever you choose, that I would be a no on a recommendation at this point, because I just don't, and I love your passion, and you have a ton of knowledge, you have knowledge I don't have, and so I'm just not comfortable personally making a recommendation based on where my knowledge base is right now. I'd really want to look at plat maps more and kind of see what all this impact is. And I have questions about if there's already flooding issues. What's the city doing to address current flooding issues? And do we only address it if we're going to increase density?
They are, just as a, may not change your mind, but they are going to do a dredging thing
Yeah.
when,
I've heard about that.
down, so they are doing something. But, yeah.
So you all can, I mean, you can move on and take yours. I just need to say where I was at the moment because I have to leave.
Okay, so since it's almost time, if you feel like you don't have enough information, you don't want to vote on anything, that's up to you. If you feel comfortable moving forward with something, and somebody wants to make a motion, that's fine too.
I'm uncomfortable voting, so I'll say at this point, I need additional information.
Okay? How about the rest of you?
It sounds like maybe more specific information on what work is being done to address the flooding issues before a recommendation is made to council. That's kind of what I'm hearing. Like, it sounds like the city is going to ameliorate some of the issues that future development is, bringing up.
Well, the future
But-
development would have to address it.
I think that's what a lot of the pushback from the general public sounds like, is I guess they want to see something more tangible as to what that is.
Well, they can't. I mean, no,
Yeah.
well, you missed this part of the conversation, but no developer is going to do a full-scale presentation until they've been provided the opportunity to actually build.
So that
'Cause that's
seems-
No
thousands
one's
of
gonna
dollars.
do hire out the civil engineering, which is a big expense, and that's what's going to address those issues. I mean, but if you're proposing any sort of, project that needs to be permitted at the state level, you're gonna need that documentation, as opposed to building single-family homes. So that's always a challenge with these types of, applications, is the public wants more information, but the developer's not gonna, invest in that because it is a lot of upfront costs until they have some
So
assurance.
then does the
that-
public just want the city to pay for that then? Is that kind
No,
of
no,
what
no,
you're
no,
getting?
no, that's not what they're saying. They're saying that it's never going to happen, that unless you actually, it's like you're going to pay for an architect for a house you want on property you don't own.
Yeah.
You would
Yep.
never do that.
Yep.
So
Yep,
that's
yep.
the-
I hear you.
Yeah. But anyway, it sounds like there's a general discomfort with making, but it is something that we should be thinking about as we move forward.
Well, there also might be a way to communicate this to the public. I don't know if we've done a great job of that to date on this project. So I would be in favor of some kind of plan, press release, whatever, to communicate these issues that we all are hearing from people out in the public to them, so that they know. I don't know if we've tried that before, if the city's done anything with that, but that sounds like that could be a good next step for us if the commission's not willing to, put its support behind the rezone at this point.
Well, the vote's going to be tonight, so then it's too late.
Yeah, that's
So
true.
it doesn't really matter. Okay, so let's plan for next month, because there is a lot of work that's being done on the revitalization stuff, neighborhood revitalization. We're working on that. And I think that there's other efforts that are going on that are pretty exciting, which I hope we'll learn more about next month. But also, how do you feel about looking into the land trusts as something that you want to work on?
I will throw my support behind that, for
Okay,
sure.
so can the new development group do some work on that?
Yeah, I'll get with Megan.
And I would suggest you talk to Carrie Pickman about it, and
Yeah.
the land bank.
Yes, yeah,
So-
because like as Zach said, philanthropic organizations could be potentially a source of that initial.
Right, and it would fit.
Seed funding.
It would, to a certain extent, fit with the effort on emergency housing and whatnot.
Yes.
Okay, can we-
Sorry, I have to go.
Can we do a
Thanks,
meeting
guys.
to adjourn?
Yes, yes, adjourn.
Thank you.
We'll go for that.